associated with chapter 5. And as you recall, chapter 5 is about global management. But the second part of chapter 5 deals with culture. And that's what we're going to look at in this second brief lecture, the culture and the role that it plays, the influence that it has on global management. I'm sure you've heard this term before, culture. We say it, we use it all the time, but sometimes we really aren't certain of what culture is. And this definition is a really good definition because it gives us precisely and concisely what, or tells us, I should say, precisely and concisely what culture really is. It is the shared set of beliefs, values, and patterns of behavior common to a group of people. Like that term, shared set of values and beliefs. So it means that culture is some kind of collective characteristic, and it is used to describe a people, right, that are, or attributes that can be related to the way that people think, the way that they act, and the way that they are likely to behave. So that's what culture is. It's a shared set of beliefs, values, and patterns of behavior. And so we use culture many times to characterize a people, to give them some type of identity, to explain why they act certain ways or why they think in certain ways. That's what we use culture for. And so because people are different, because their values and their beliefs and the way that they behave are different across the world, we will tend to see different cultures emerging across the world, and we will tend to see cultural conflicts emerging across the world. One of the biggest impediments to global management is this idea, or is this concept, I should say, of culture shock. And what is culture shock? Well, it is the confusion and discomfort a person experiences in an unfamiliar culture. I don't know how much of you or how many of you have traveled and what types of countries you have visited. But when you get to places, or when you visit countries that are very different from your home country, you sometimes use the word strange, you might tend to suffer from some level of culture shock. I give you an example. I was recently in China, and I had never visited China. I had never visited a country that was relatively dissimilar politically and economically. Although China is becoming much like the United States, it is still somewhat distinct. I had never visited a country that was so distinct from what I had known in terms of the politics, in terms of the way of life. And I get to China, and one of the things that really shocked me, I guess that would be the best word to use, was how different China was with respect to personal freedoms. In the United States, you can go anywhere, you can say anything, you can act pretty much in any type of manner. Not so in China. It is heavily regulated. Where you can go, what you can say, how you can act is somewhat controlled by the government, by the police. And so that presented me with an issue that I had to overcome in order to be fully comfortable and in order to operate successfully in China. Many times, firms and the people that work for those firms aren't able to get over their initial culture shock. They see the world, they see these new countries as being so strange and being so different that it is difficult for them to engage in that country, for them to be successful and live comfortably in that country, and therefore they do not actually benefit from that foreign investment, from that foreign interaction. So culture shock can be a major impediment to global management and to global cooperation, I should say. And the way that people overcome culture shock is through cultural intelligence. And it says here it's the ability to adapt and adjust to new cultures. Well, that's what I had to do. When I was in China, I had to adapt and adjust to the way that they did things, the kinds of food that they ate, the language, the way people interacted and socialized, the way that I should teach in a class, the dress. Those things I had to adapt to. And the way that you become culturally intelligent is obviously, again, being in the culture and learning, observing. But even before you go to a different country, or before you interact with a new culture, you might want to do some research and you might want to do some training. Many times firms, if they're sending their workers across to international markets, will send them through to training exercises, through cultural training exercises, to make them familiar or somewhat familiar with what they will be meeting once they get into those new cultures. It's essentially a way to reduce the level of cultural shock because you know beforehand, to some extent, what you are likely to be up against, what you're likely to face, what you're likely uh, to realize once you get into that new culture. So that can reduce the level of culture shock and also make it easier for one to do business and to operate successfully in the new foreign location environment. But related to culture shock and to some extent the lack of cultural intelligence is this concept of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is simply the tendency to consider one's own culture as superior to others. Now, make no mistake about it, regardless of whether you come from a big country or a small country, we all tend to have some measure, some proclivity towards ethnocentrism. The reason is because we often feel that no matter where we are or no matter where we come from, we or our culture is the best. And I have to say that I've seen a level of ethnocentrism to some extent in New Orleans. And with good reason for this. Great things in New Orleans, the food, the music, the people. But we can become a bit spoiled and we can become a bit judgmental with respect to other people's cultures. And we might tend to see ours as being superior to their culture. We have to be careful. Now, I used to take students over to Germany, and I would always tell them that when you go to Germany, be very, very careful that you do not try to compare everything that you see in Germany to what occurs in the United States. Because when you do that, you may tend to fall into this trap of ethnocentrism. You start thinking, oh, you know what, well, we do this better in the US. So if things are better, our language is better, our music, you have to be careful. Of course, you can identify those differences. Differences abound, and it should be okay for you to identify them. However, when you start judging someone's culture based upon your own, when you start seeing yourself as being superior to them relative to your culture, then that's when a problem arises. And if you're ethnocentric, if you think of yourself as superior, then you're probably not likely to make a lot of friends, and you're probably not likely to be very, very successful in those foreign markets. This is some of the stages in adjusting to a new culture, and this is kind of where the culture shock comes in. I'm not going to spend too much time, but just quickly, you sometimes start off with being somewhat confused, right? And then you learn a little bit about the culture. You get the small victories. You go through this honeymoon phase where you think, oh, I've got this together. Then you might start getting a little bit irritated and angry at where you are, start missing home. And then you really get the reality, okay? This is what I'm living in. This is the culture. This is what I must adapt to. These are some of what we call the silent languages of culture. And I'm going to go through them. I'll give you an idea about how they influence or impact cultures and influence the way that people that are operating in these cultures do business. So we have three areas or components of the silent language. We have context, space, and time. What do we mean by context? Well, in a low context culture, these cultures tend to emphasize the communication via the spoken or the written words. So in a low context culture, things really are spelled out. Everything is detailed, everything is very specific, and everything is written down or spoken, and you mean what you say. And some of the countries that demonstrate a low context type of culture, like the United States, Canada, Germany, all of these countries are known for being very precise, very detailed. When you go to meetings in the United States, everybody has a notepad. Everybody is taking notes. Everything is written down. When we have meetings in the division of business, somebody's always taking minutes. Somebody's always writing everything down. Or people give speeches and things are spoken and written. You have written instructions, spoken instructions, very detailed. That's the low context cultures. Everything is about what you say, how it is detailed and written down. In high context cultures, there is, of course, some written or spoken, but there is a lot more reliance on what we call nonverbal or situational cues. So, kind of like how you look when you say certain things, right? The turn the I'm sorry, the tone that you use, your expressions, those are the things that people in high context cultures use to make sense of what is being said. So places like Thailand and Malaysia, they are not as detailed and not as specific as say in the United States in terms of their communication. In China, the running joke for many Americans is that when people in China say no, it doesn't necessarily mean you no, or when they say yes, it doesn't necessarily mean yes. Yes can be yes, I agree, or yes can be I'm thinking about it, and yes could be no, I don't agree at all. It really depends on the context. It depends on what is when it is being said, how it is being said, cues, nonverbal cues, body language, and all those things to try to make sense of it. That's what we call high context cultures. It's more about the nonverbal, the non-written, than it is about the written and the verbal. Another component of the silent language is the time issue. And let me tell you, from someone who is coming initially from a polychronic culture, monochronic cultures are sometimes very, very hard to operating. Well, what is a monochronic culture? It's where people tend to do one thing at a time. It is all about being focused and somewhat specific in terms of what is being done and when it is being done. Americans set deadlines, right? That is an attribute of a monochronic culture. It's very, very time oriented. There is time, there is an agenda, there is a deadline. We are focusing on doing one thing, we do it to completion, and when it's ended, we begin something else. Notice that the countries that are mentioned in the monochronic culture as having a monochronic culture are the same countries that have low context cultures. And that's somewhat understandable because low context cultures, just like monochronic cultures, are all about specificity, all about details, all about precision. I'll give you an example. I had a friend of mine who is German, and I asked him to pick me up to go to the airport, and he asked me what time, and I said 10 o'clock. Now, where I come from, and I'm going to explain that in a moment, I come from a more polychronic type of culture where time is much more fluid and much less specific and precise. So when I say 10 as a Trinidadian, 10 sometimes means 10:15, it can mean 10:30, it can also mean 11. Now, he is German, so when he hears 10, it means 10. So at 10 o'clock, precisely 10 o'clock, not 9:59, not 10:01, at 10 o'clock, he was ringing my doorbell. Suffice to say, I was still in the shower because I am from a polychronic culture where time is much more fluid. People do many different things at one time. There isn't so much of a concern about deadlines, about meeting certain deadlines, about getting there on time. Lunch doesn't have to be 1 hour, it can be 2 hours. We can be discussing this and also be discussing that at the same time. There isn't that logical flow, there isn't that specificity, there isn't that precision. And for people that come from monochronic cultures and go and try to do business in polychronic cultures, it can be a little bit frustrating. Because here you are working on a deadline, you're trying to set a project up, you're trying to have logical steps in place, and in a polychronic culture, you're not getting through, you're not getting that logic, you're not getting that detail being agreed upon, people aren't coming to meetings on time, you're not necessarily sure what is being done, when it is being done, you don't have a timeline. It can become very, very frustrating. But look at it from the opposite way. What if you're from a polychronic culture and now you're operating in a monochronic culture? You might want to know, why are they pushing me? Why is there so much concern about deadlines? Why can't we discuss multiple things? Why must we only focus on this one thing? My brain doesn't work like that. Well, again, there can be conflicts. And in order to overcome that, as we mentioned earlier, you have to have a level of cultural intelligence. And then the last area of the silent language of culture is the proxemics, and that's kind of how people use space to communicate. Well, I can tell you this: being in the United States for the last 12 years, I fully understand what Americans mean when they talk about personal space. Personal space is important to Americans. So when you're communicating with someone in the United States, you normally leave literally space between you and that individual. You don't come too close because then you will be invading that person's personal space. But in many Latin American, Asian, I would also suggest European cultures, that is not the case. I was just at a seminar in Europe, and many Europeans and many people from Latin and South America came up to me after only meeting me for a very brief moment and hugged me, gave me kisses on the cheek, were basically right next to me or right in front of me when speaking. And I didn't necessarily see that as being totally different because of the culture that I grew up in, and it wasn't necessarily uncomfortable for me. But I can see how it could be uncomfortable for many people, especially Americans, who have not been privy or who have not grown up in a culture that essentially has less space or uses less space in communication. So understanding that again is important to explaining and perhaps limiting the amount of obstacles there are to cultural interface. So those are the three: silent language, context, space, and the time issue. The last thing we're going to look at in terms of culture is the cultural values. And there's this guy called Geert Hofstede, and he was a Dutch researcher, and he tried to create specific types of cultural traits that could be utilized to define cultures across the world. And he came up with 5 different cultural traits or cultural values that he measured countries on, and then determined based on those measures what types of cultures these countries possess. And these 5 cultural values are power distance, uncertainty avoidance, individualism or collectivism, masculinity or femininity, and time orientation. I'm going to quickly go through these 5 and try to explain to you what they really mean. Well, in power distance, what Hofstede is talking about is that country's acceptance of differences in terms of authority or in terms of social status. In high power distance cultures, those people in those types of cultures are more willing to accept the superiority of people that are seen as being higher up or higher in the hierarchy than they are. What do I mean by that? Well, in a high power distance type country, workers will tend to defer more easily to their bosses. The reason why is because they accept that there should be some type of power differential between them and their superiors, and they will likely treat their superiors with a level of deference that you will not necessarily see in a lower power distance country like the United States. In the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell actually uses power distance to explain why there were so many crashes in an Asian airline. And the reason he attributed to these crashes was because of the power distance that occurred between the pilot and the co-pilot. The co-pilot knew that something was wrong, that the plane could potentially crash and they could all be killed, but because there was a level of fear and a level of respect because of the power distance in that culture, the co-pilot chose to say nothing because he or she did not believe it was their place to question authority. That is a characteristic of a high power distance type culture. There is very little interaction between superiors and subordinates because subordinates believe that they should follow their leader no matter what. You should not question respect. You should accept the difference in power and difference in authority, and thereby simply follow the instructions that are given to you. Not that case in low power distance. People are much more open with their superiors. There's much more opportunity for participative management, if you will, much greater level of interaction. People are willing to question their authority in low power distance countries. The second cultural trait or cultural value that Hofstadter identifies, high uncertainty avoidance. Well, as the name implies, countries that have high uncertainty avoidance are unwilling or less willing to make drastic changes. They don't want to make drastic changes. They're not very open to change, and therefore they try to maintain as much as possible the status quo. In countries like this, tradition and the way of doing things is protected because those countries do not want to have major change. In low uncertainty avoidance countries, these countries are much more open to change, much more open to the evolution of things, and therefore they are willing to take greater risk than those countries that have high uncertainty avoidance. And if you look at the countries that are high uncertainty avoidance, you'll see a country called Japan. Japan is what we would call a very traditionalist society. They follow the rules. They have great respect for tradition. They don't like drastic change. They like to maintain the status quo. Whereas in the United States, it is a much more open, evolving nation. It is a much younger nation than Japan, and therefore it has had major change and drastic change over the last 3 centuries or even more, and therefore there's a greater openness in this country to change as opposed to the Japanese. The third cultural trait or value, and it's probably the one that you're most familiar with, is this concept of individualism versus collectivism. Individualism versus collectivism. You will probably have heard the term or someone say that America is a very individualistic country. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that in this country, the rights of the individual, the right to pursue opportunity, the right to basically make a success of yourself is more strongly held than the rights of the collective society. It does not mean that Americans are necessarily selfish or self-centered, but it does mean that many times in the United States, the right of the individual is superior to the right of society. We have enshrined in the Constitution the right of the individual, and we protect those rights even at times where it has a direct conflict with the rights to society. So in the United States and places like Australia, it's high on individualism, more concerned with the individual than it is with the society. And you see that also in the way that we live our lives in terms of something like sports. In the United States, you have an award in most sports, whether it be professional or even amateur, of the most valuable player. Even in a team sport, you're singling out one individual. We have the American Idol. We look at stars, individuals. Again, individual rights and individual accomplishments are many times prioritized over social rights and social achievement. Not so in collectivist societies. Collectivist societies, it is more about what is best for society than what is best for the individual. And again, I was recently in Europe and we were talking about this. Europeans tend to be much more collectivist than Americans, which is why something like social responsibility, something like sustainability might be an easier concept to grasp or to implement in places like Europe than it is in the United States, because inherently it requires an individual to subjugate their personal requirements, their personal rights for the rights and the responsibilities, the rights and the goodwill of society. And many times in an individualistic culture, that's difficult to do. That is very difficult to do, to subjugate your rights for the betterment of society. And so it's easier in a collectivist society because those societies see themselves more as a society, more as a whole, a common whole, than they do see themselves as just individuals that happen to be all located in one area. The fourth cultural trait is masculinity versus femininity. The names are somewhat misleading here. It does not mean that in Japan and Mexico and the United States, people are stronger or more male than they are in Sweden. But what it does mean is that in these types of countries, people tend to demonstrate what we would call more masculine types of values. Things like assertiveness, things like strength, things like powers tend to be prioritized in those types of countries. Values that are normally related to males. That's why Hofstadter uses the term masculine. So it doesn't mean that there are more males in Japan or Mexico. There might be, but it does not mean that. It means that in those countries, those types of values, those type of traits or attributes normally related to men, things like assertiveness and power and confidence, those things tend to be prioritized than in a place like Sweden where more feminine type cultural values or more feminine type attributes are prevalent in terms of things like compassion, things like human rights. Those things that tend to be, I would say, softer type values. So the femininity versus masculinity. And the last one is the short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. It's a short-term orientation versus the long-term orientation. This has to do to some extent with gratification. Okay, are we willing to sacrifice in the short term for the long-term benefits? In the United States, many times the answer to that is no. And again, that's perhaps one of the problems associated with successfully implementing social responsibility and sustainability in the United States, because those concepts require, to some extent, sacrificing short-term gain for long-term benefit. And in these types of cultures where there's more short-term orientation, we want to succeed today without really considering what the implications are for the future. Whereas in a country like Japan, there is much more concern for the long-term orientation, for the long-term perspective than there is for the short-term. So in Japan, people are more likely to save, people are more likely to sacrifice their short-term interests in order to survive and be successful in the long term, and that's demonstrated in many different aspects of their life. So all this gives you is an idea about the different cultural traits, the different cultural attributes that countries can be measured on. Hofstadter used this to help explain why certain countries and people in certain countries thought and act the way they did based on the influence of this culture. And of course, this is important in terms of comparative management, recognizing the differences and then obviously acting or pursuing your management style in different ways, adapting to the cultures. And as it says here, global managers need to successfully apply their functions across international boundaries. As we said in chapter 1, of course, all managers must plan, they must organize, they must lead and control. But the way that you do that might differ based on where you're operating and the culture that you are operating in. You might have to adapt to better meet the needs of that culture and locale. So that in a nutshell is our cultural discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this was informative. Take care.